Thank you all for being here. I'm Ann Kirshner, and you're here for a panel called How Do Women Regain Momentum in Computer Science and Why It's Critically Important, and I'm going to unpack that title in a moment. Let me start with thanks first to Deborah Quazzo, who always keeps this issue front and center at the conference, and we're very grateful for that. We've got a terrific panel today coming from lots of different perspectives. We've got Emily Glassberg-Sands from Coursera, Judy Spitz from Women in Technology in New York, Whitney and Cornell Tech. We've got Kalani. You know, you just told me how to pronounce it and I mispronounced it, sorry. Kalani Cook from Black Tech Nation, and we've got Colleen Lewis from Harvard. Harvey Mudd. I promise I'm not going to mangle anybody else's names because we're good to go. So think of that sense. How do women regain momentum in CS and why it's critically important? First of all, it assumes that women had momentum and lost it and now need to regain it. So that's a set of assumptions. And then the second part, why it's critically important. And I thought we would start today by looking at that premise and ask ourselves the question in the year 2019, do we still have that problem? Do we need to restate the premises of the problem? And I thought I'd turn to our panel to kick us off with thinking about the premise of the problem.
I'll be happy to start because as part of the Whitney program, spent a lot of time looking at the numbers. I also spent the first 30 years of my career working in corporate America, and so only started to pick my head up from that focus and look at these numbers in the last few years. So everybody knows the number, I think, that is oft quoted, 37% back in 1985, 18% today. And that's what people are responding to, and maybe there was momentum in 1985 or not. Depends whether you think 37% is a great number. I actually think there's a couple of other angles on that data that I think are important. One is that we hit that low of 18% way back in 2006. So it's equally as interesting to me that in spite of all of the attention and all of the sessions like this that there have been in the last 10 years, that number has been stubbornly resistant to change. And that's interesting. The second, though, of course, is the other way to look at the number. One of the challenges with that number is that it's the percentage of the graduating classes that are women, which means even though the actual raw number could be going up, if the number of men goes up also, the percentage stays the same. So the other way to look at the data is of all of the women who go to undergraduate school and graduate, what percent of them are studying computer science? And if you don't know that number, it's around 1%.
1%.
Which is a remarkable number. Especially because there, what you're balancing against is that the percentage of the undergraduate ranks that are women keeps going up. So now the percentage of the undergraduate ranks that are women is close to 58%. It'll be 60% in the not too distant future. So there you're really battling against the real thing. The next logical question is what percent of the men major in computer science? The answer is 6%. So here's the thing to remember. If you go back to the IPEDS data and you actually look at these numbers, if you could move that 1% of women to 5%, just 5% of the undergraduate women studying computer science, you would double the number of tech workers in the country. And that is solving a workforce challenge in addition to the other important diversity issues around women in tech.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, so much progress has been made in so many different areas, and yet that remains such a stubborn one. I was thinking about this recently because my daughter was looking for an obstetrician and wanted a woman. And my husband said, I don't know why she feels so strongly about having a woman. You didn't have a woman. And I said, honey, 30 years ago when I had my first child, there were very, very few women obstetricians, whereas now there are more women in medical school than men. Okay, so we are capable of solving these kinds of problems, but in computer science, where the need is so great, we are stuck. Okay,
but I think it's super tricky to look at medicine as our example because from my understanding of what's happened from sort of history of science medicine descriptions is that actually the field became stratified. And so that's one of my concerns about the field of computing is this process of stratification. So there are certain specialties in medicine that are stigmatized and feminized and devalued and pay less. And I think that we could have the same thing happen in computing. Yep. And I think certainly we see that with how people talk about the hard stuff, systems, etc., versus like human-centered computing or anything that involves any humans whatsoever. And so I think over the next 10 years, we're more likely to have a process of stratification of computing disciplines rather than like fixing sexism such that, you know, we've got a bunch of women computer scientists who are getting paid equally to men. But we'll be able to justify paying them less because they're in these fields that are devalued.
Just to point to that, because I have a very unlikely way of entering into computer science. So I went through a boot camp. And I remember after graduating the boot camp how much I was pushed towards QA and front end. Like immediately, like no one asked me if I like to do queries or SQL or data. Like no one even really asked. It was just like, oh, so you like front end, right? Like you like to design. I'm like, it's cool, you know, but it's funny that you just mentioned that, like how easily that could happen. And so we have to be careful of the numbers with that.
And I think it'll be interesting over the next few years as computer science departments start to include data science departments. Like what is the process of stratification? My hypothesis is that data science, even though it's like the sexy hot thing right now, is gonna become feminized. That's my bet.
But that if the pay were equal, would that be a problem?
I think if we still have really toxic narratives about who sorts to what and why, like, yeah, it's still a problem. I mean, like...
Right, it's better, it's progress.
Let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
That's kind of what
totally.
As a woman in data science, you know, I think we have a problem when 75% of high school girls say they want to study STEM, and then we have these abysmal numbers 4 years later. I think part of it is connecting the computer science education or the data science education to solving the set of challenges that women on average care more about, right? And so tying that link between, there are human problems in health and in education that can be solved with computer science, with data science. More and more of the systems that are powering society are technology systems, and we need women in the room, and it's an opportunity. So I don't know, I'm worried about the perfect being the enemy of the good.
Totally,
I'd be happy with a room full of female data scientists. Right now, I think it's like 25% female, so we could do better.
There are two things.
Sure.
One is this danger of using STEM as a synonym for computer science.
Yeah.
We know that the numbers in the sciences and in math, we're close to 50-50. We're in pretty good shape. Engineering's not great, but at least it's been inching up. It's only computer science. It's the T.
It's only the T.
And so, you know, to the extent that we throw those two terms out as if they're the same, I think it can lead us down a garden path. But Colleen, to your point, I think an interesting statistic that's a harbinger of what you're concerned about is that the numbers of women in AI is even worse than the numbers in computer science, and it's the highest paying, hottest, you know, job category within computer science.
And it doesn't make sense because it's basically just math.
That's right.
And we're
There's
doing
no
fine in
difference.
math.
Right.
So I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's not, we can't just think about the intellectual work that someone's doing within a discipline to understand what patterns will replicate. We have to consider this broader narrative.
Right.
We still have to like celebrate every success and like do the small steps, but.
So what's holding it back? And then we'll get to start talking about some solutions. Like why aren't the women showing up?
Do you want to start like what parts, in what age group, and at what level are we talking about?
Well,
'Cause I
we
think it's
should talk about, you know, at some point, are we talking about all women? Are we talking how do we segment our approach to women, and also what age groups do we really want to focus on? I think for the most part, we'll be talking here about adult women, because I don't think we want to take the point of view that if you didn't learn how to do Python in kindergarten, you know, life is over. So we'll focus mostly on adults, but maybe drift into K-12 a little bit later on. So you're a woman who's done, you know, reasonably well in high school, and you get into college, and what happens when you approach computer science?
The reason I asked about age is because and I'm gonna tie this around, I promise. There's a documentary about Barbie on Netflix that I just watched the other day.
Ooh.
So good. The history of Barbie and how it has infiltrated our minds as women and as American society in general, and how we rank ourselves according to our worth when it comes to image. And I thought to myself, especially when it comes to computer science, if we were as encouraged in computer science as we are, or judged as much in computer science as we are of our looks when we're very, very young, we would be so much, we would rule tech. But we would. But there is some seed that is being planted very early on that our worth is so much based on things that boys don't ever have to go through. How many times are we called pretty, or you're cute, or you're this, or you're so nice, or you're this, and it's you start to think that this is just what my value is. I shouldn't be doing the hard things. I'm supposed to be here and be cute. And so maybe computers or stuff like that is just more for boys. And I think even as broad as that sounds, I do think that small messaging like that does affect why girls don't go into computer science, even at the high school level.
But is there something special about computer science? Because as we were saying before, the women are going into math, they're going into engineering, they're doing all those things. Is there something special, especially pernicious that has happened in computer science to keep the door closed?
So I think, we work exclusively with undergraduate women, and two things. I think that we all know that there are stereotypes about not only what people go into computer science, we all know that, right? There's that sort of white geeky guy stereotype, but there's also a lot of mythology around what a career in technology is actually like. I can tell you, I talk to these young women all the time. I work with students at the City University of New York who are 85% students of color from challenging socioeconomic status, families. They don't have a lot of firsthand experience with people who are actually in tech careers. And there's this universal belief that, number one, it's for loners, right? Which nothing could be further from the truth. I spent my 30-year career in tech. I've never worked on anything but a team. And that there's only one role, and that is people who hack code. The idea that there's actually a very broad set of possible roles, and that it is very team-oriented, is not widely understood. And so, if you're starting from a position where you haven't been encouraged all along the way, the question is, what is the motivation to push through what I call an obstacle course of disincentives, as opposed to say, well, I'm good in math and science, I'll go study biology. There's nothing wrong with that. And so part of what we do is spend some time with these students early, right before they start college and as they're rising sophomores, and expose them to this is what the digital product development life cycle is about. It has all of these different phases. And yes, it involves some coding, and that's fantastic, but it's part of a process. And we get a lot of, wow, I had no idea. So maybe now I'll be brave enough to take that first class.
You're looking troubled.
I'm thinking. I'm thinking. Because then how come, if that's the case, then why is it that, so do all the boys know that those are all the positions available in computer science? I would guess that they both would be discovering this at the same time, so still, why is it that the women?
Because I think the stereotype is more attractive to the sort of typical male. First of all, the role models we know are these geeky guys. And so you have more young men say, I don't mind aspiring to be that.
I think it relates more to the core narratives of sexism and racism. So a core narrative of sexism and racism is that white men are intellectually superior. And our narrative about computer science is that it is just the cream of the crop, the top of the top, you gotta be an innate ability. And so the ways in which our narratives about who can do computing and what intellectual capacity it involves then butts heads against our like explicitly sexist and racist beliefs, or more likely these unconscious, unintentional biases about who can do this work. And so, you know, like when I went to declare my major, I had my advisor bring over another advisor to talk me out of it because I wouldn't like it.
I was just going to ask, don't you think that's part of the core problem? Is it the advisor level?
Mansplaining, it sounds like.
No,
No, I didn't mean what you said.
I
I didn't mean that.
I can tell you that I have had many students come to me and tell me that their college advisors are encouraging them not to take computer science classes.
To your point, yeah.
Hold on. You're going to get a lot of flack on the internet if you keep talking. Just like as a heads up, do you know what I mean? Because we got an all-woman plan. No, but do you know what I mean? Just like as an all-woman panel.
You're doing the thing. You're doing the thing.
Okay, let's go back
So
to.
super simply looking at the data, right?
Thank you.
You take women in computer science on Coursera, you look at their first class, which is generally an entry-level class. And here we're just identifying gender based on first name and geolocation. So it's not perfect, but you capture maybe about 80% correctly. And you say, and this is emulating work that Claudia Golden actually did in an on-campus setting, but you say, what is the rate of dropout, their likelihood of going on to complete that course and take additional courses as a function of early signals that they get about whether or not they can do it. So these are things like how do they do on their first assignment, or how do they do in the first module, or how do they do in the first course. And what you see is that women have a way steeper drop-off relative to men. So they respond much more intensely to these negative signals. Now, in the on-campus environment, you might say, oh, that's optimal because grades matter a lot and they're optimizing for grades and whatever. I don't know. I wouldn't argue that, but one could. But in the online environment, no one's looking at your grades.
Right.
So that's you reading into a signal. By the way, the men are also, men are getting B's and C's and persisting on by and large. Women are getting B's and C's and saying this isn't for me. And I actually think that reiterates, it's a little bit proof of concept for what you're saying, which is we have this vision of computer science as something that white men are really well positioned to do. And when people in
Genetically favored.
Right, genetically favored.
You almost
right?
said programmed.
Program, there you go, sorry. And so if you get a signal that's a little bit against that, right, you power through. But if you're a woman and you're coming from a position of, I'm not sure I can do this, then you respond really intensely to those signals. So it's interesting to see in the data. And then if you provide them review material, so this is my favorite. So you can intervene with learners in different ways. One of the ones we do is we provide review material to people who fail the assignment. So review material dramatically increases the rate at which women persist, has no effect on male learners. The primary mechanism is that male learners don't actually review the recommended review material. Female learners do, and they persist through. So I think there are small steps that we can take as a society, but certainly in the data we see that really steep drop off for female learners in computer science.
Yeah.
At a minimum, departments should be surveying their students to see, like, is this a super toxic place to be a student? That you should know that. Do you know what I mean? Like, survey your students. Seems like NC WIT has one. The Computing Research Association has one. Use one of those surveys and ask your students, is it terrible here?
So we're going to get to talking about some of the specific solutions that you all have implemented in your areas. But if you go to the absolute opposite of the case now, where you have 1% of college students, of college women studying computer science, could the answer be that everybody ought to study computer science? That if you get everybody in the swimming pool, that's the way to go about it? That it used to be reading, writing, and arithmetic; those were the literacies that you needed to survive. It's reading, writing, arithmetic, and computational literacy. Is that a solution?
So I think with the rate at which the world is changing, people need a certain set of foundational skills. And there are computational skills and math skills and critical thinking skills and systems thinking skills all encompassed in that. But that doesn't mean that everyone needs to be a mathematician or a computer scientist. I think courses like CS50 and like very broad courses that provide a lot of people a lightweight way to get access is really compelling. One of the things that we do at Coursera, so we have about 160 university partners, and some of our partners provide access to their Coursera content online to students. And so you take an institution like Duke, where someone might be afraid to take a computer science course because they don't want to get a bad grade and have it pull down their average, but they're happy to take the online version where they're not being judged, and in fact those are foundational skills that they want to develop and know will serve them throughout life. So I wouldn't go so far as to say everyone should be a computer scientist, but that everyone needs certain sets of foundational knowledge in order to be able to adapt throughout their working life, and that computational skills are one part of that bundle.
By the way, the course that Emily alluded to, CS50, which I did take online, I will tell you, is the most popular course, I'm told, at Harvard. And at Princeton now, the #1 major is computer science. I don't know how many other colleges that is true of, but so you are seeing lots of numbers shift, just maybe not so much for women. Colleen, you've written about CS literacy as foundational or not, and whether it's a panacea for understanding the world we live in. You want to respond to that a little bit?
Yeah, and I don't think this is contrasting what people are saying particularly, but I think a thing that people say is that computer science teaches you how to think, and so everyone needs access to computer science for that reason. And I'm like, oh, well, like I have these computer science classes as a computer scientist, and I see the world as a computer scientist, but I don't know that my glasses are better than your glasses. Right. And I think the idea that computer science teaches you to think is incredibly problematic in thinking that like, oh, lots of disciplines think. And even before the students come to my classroom, they're thinking, you know. And so I think I like push back against that. I do have a pitch where it's like, oh, you know what? Education is responsible for making sure people can live adult lives and interact with the world around them. So they need to understand what a conditional is and a loop is to understand the ubiquitous computing in their area. Yeah. I say like an hour a year for sure, conditionals and loops. And then I think they need to learn to interact on the internet securely and privately. I might even go 2 hours every year, security and privacy on the internet. And then the third piece that is the ways in which analyzing data and fundamentally statistics in machine learning or big data or whatever, neural nets, yada, 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 deep learning is fundamentally changing the way technology is going to interact with them. And maybe that should be an hour, maybe in the future that will have to be more, but this like because I'm a computer scientist and I think about the world as a computer scientist, that everyone should and everyone needs to learn to code, and I'm not into it.
Wow, 5 hours and we're done. That's
5 hours every year. That's 5 hours every year.
Cool.
So I'll take the other position, and
like
it's not because I think everybody needs to think differently. I think a basic understanding of how software development gets done, even if you never write a line of code in your life after that, is basic literacy at this point. And the reason why I advocate strongly, and of course this came from Harvey Mudd, where Colleen hails from, because they made it a requirement, but they also changed the course dramatically so that, you know, the way I think CS0 is taught in most universities is the way organic chemistry is taught, as to weed for medical students, to weed out anybody but the diehard. And so people teach the absolute worst, most boring bits and bytes in network architecture. So anybody who is going, they run screaming unless you are really committed. I think it's exactly the opposite in terms of the problem that we're trying to solve. We should not worry about bits and bytes and network and all that boring stuff. Put the power of learning how to write a few lines of codes and see something happen into the hands of everybody who goes to undergraduate school, and teach it in a sort of this isn't an end in itself. It's whatever problem you're really passionate about solving is most likely going to require this kind of solution. You may not be the person developing it, but you're going to be working with people who are. I think that's fundamental literacy. And by the way, if you did that, some percentage of the young women who took that class will get interested. And as I said at the beginning, you only need a few percent. We're not trying to convince 50% of the women who walk in that class, or the men, to take the next class. Just a few percentage. And I do believe that if you did that and you taught the class the way all the research has been shown, with, by the way, all the teaching methodology that Colleen evangelizes about around the country, not just the content matter, but how you teach it pedagogically, you would get more women engaged, and I think you'd actually solve this problem.
Let's shift, because mostly we've been talking about the role of higher education in offering solutions. Let's shift a little bit to the role of the private sector. What's been your experience in working with companies as far as their hiring practices are concerned, as far as their willingness to broaden their approach to recruiting a robust pipeline of women into their companies? And the last piece of it, which is ensuring that when the women do come into the companies, they come into a culture that they can thrive in, not the kind of culture we read about. Was it last year? The great book about the toxic culture of technology companies in Silicon Valley. But let's talk a little bit about the private sector.
A lot of my work has to do with the recruitment of Black technologists. So a lot of my stuff is very rooted in the Black community. And I can speak from my experience in that space, also as a Black woman. I think that companies are very transactional. I don't think that they are willing to, I'm not gonna say willing, because I do think that there is lately a very innate want to be better, right? And we're having the conversations and that's great, but I don't think that they are putting the actual budgets, the actual milestones, the actual plans together to be transformational when it comes to women and people of color entering into their organizations. I think they think, oh, well, let's fix our recruiting and like get a certain percentage and then we've met our goal. Like, let's just try to get to this number. And I think it's just so much more than that. It's about cultural transformation and making women feel comfortable in more ways than one than just like a position. And I can talk about that in many ways, especially as a Black woman, but.
So how do you push against that? How do you?
I mean, I encourage, so I'm just now with my organization beginning to talk to companies, and they come to me a lot about like, okay, what is it that you want us to do? And I'm like, well, what are your goals? Like, what goals have you actually set up besides just a number? And so it's just about actually creating a plan, and what does that look like? And once people are hired, like, what are you willing to change about your organization, and how deep are you willing to go, and how honest are you willing to be with your employees and with the people who you're recruiting about where you stand, and just like looking at the landscape of your company and being honest about it. I think that it starts there as well. Like, people don't want to be honest. You don't think
they should just complain about the pipeline?
Well, yeah, sure. Let's do that.
Exactly.
So Judy, you deal with really
we do.
big. You want to talk about some of the companies who are involved in Whitney?
Sure. Well, so Whitney is sort of an ecosystem play. That is, it's focused in New York, and the goal is to marry up CUNY, which has 250,000 undergraduate students. So
250,000 full-time, another 250,000 part-time. Sorry, just little CUNY lore.
And it's the most diverse urban public education institution in the country. So you've got this incredible pool of potential resources, scale and diversity, and then you've got the New York tech ecosystem. So what Whitney is trying to do is create a marriage there. And as everybody has said, you know, companies set numbers and they all say they want diversity. And here's the concrete realization. So we work with companies around New York City, and we try to get them to recruit for summer internships from the CUNY women that we work with. They don't normally recruit from CUNY, they recruit from other places, and they sort of say, okay, yes, we will. We did that for a couple of years, and what we found is that less than 5% of the women who submitted their applications for summer internships were getting hired. So we go back to the companies and we said, what's going on here? You know, you said you wanted to hire these students. And they basically said, well, you know, they don't have anything on their resumes. These are students who were working 2 and 3 part-time jobs and so on and so forth. So there's sort of an intentionality there, but then there's one door in. So as we like to say in Whitney, if the traditional doors are closed, we're going to build a new door and open it. And so we created this program called a Winternship. Very briefly, it's a mini 3-week paid internship in January for freshmen and sophomores before they're trying to be competitive as juniors and seniors. And here's the key. It's a low barrier to entry for the companies. We basically say to the companies, it's 3 weeks in January. It's not the peak of your internship season. Take a few of these Whitney students and give them an experience. Give them some resume juice. Mm-hmm. And so this past January, 60 companies around the New York tech ecosystem hired 300 of these young women. And the results are unbelievable. 54% of these kids landed summer jobs. Only half of them were at those host companies. That little 3-week experience these students could parlay into being able to talk the talk. They had been there, they had a story to tell. But equally as importantly is that the companies were coming up to us saying, thank you, these kids were unbelievable. They don't normally have a way to get in the door, but when they do, they bring not only their smarts, but they bring this completely different energy and a whole new set of ideas. So I think we have to think creatively about how to create other entry doors into this sort of tech ecosystem.
So I'm going to take winternships as one very concrete idea for all of you to think of as one sort of problem-solving approach to this. And then I want to turn to the other panelists and say, if there's one thing we want to send them all out singing about, what would it be for you?
So I think education has made huge strides in terms of ability to scale high quality teaching, to provide human capital to lots and lots of people who wouldn't otherwise be able to get it. But I think there's this key that we have to turn around credentials, and whether that credential comes from internships or something else. I think, so long as people are screened based on the companies they've worked for or the degree they happen to get first, we're not going to be able to break through that glass ceiling. And so, in the case of Coursera, it may be a bottoms-up skills-based credential, but I think there are many others. I think all of us need to be thinking about what are the credentials of the future that are going to set a more even playing field, that are going to allow people to be rewarded for what they know, including lifelong learning that happens later in life, that are really going to increase social mobility.
So that's interesting because both of your examples involve credential that also confers social capital.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting convergence. Okay,
Yeah.
what's our
So once again, I entered into this. I mean, you ladies are like tech ladies. I just got into tech like not even 3 years ago. So I was a very, boot camp, and I had never thought I would end up in tech. So once I did, the reason I got so many opportunities specifically in Pittsburgh is because I had a white male who sponsored me, and he opened up the doors for me and made sure he introduced me to everyone and made sure that I got the resources and the learning materials to continue on this trajectory in tech. And I would just ask that, since we know that white men like literally pretty much hold all of the doors for especially scaling in tech or advancing in tech, just to who's that woman or who's that person, woman who you see and has potential, like what are you doing to really open up the doors for her, especially within even your organization? Maybe it's an employee or a colleague. Are you sitting down with her to ask her, what are her goals? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? How can I help? How can I open up my network? How can I give you resource or learning tools to continue your education? I just attributed a lot of my early success just entering into tech to people who invested in me continuing to push forward.
mentorship? So key.
Okay, I would add a last piece is if we're talking about women in tech or women in computing, we need to make sure that we're not assuming that that only means white women. And we can't think about sexism as separate from racism. They're just not.
It's impossible.
Right, it's impossible. When you think of a woman, if you just think of a white woman like me, you need to expand your ideas about women. We come in all colors, it turns out. Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, no, you wouldn't even believe it. And we don't come in blue and purple. Don't say that, but we, So we need to be talking about racism as part of every conversation about women in tech. Yeah. Sorry.
Terrific. Thank you all very much for defining the problem, explaining why it's important, and also coming up with some really concrete solutions from the work that you're all doing in your own communities. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.